turn. So you may have a question for somebody, but if you can just save that to the end. And then to ask a question, on the side of at the bottom, you'll see there's options there where it says chat. If you press the chat button, then on the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a place where you can just type in a question. Just type Q for now. And then what we'll do is I'll be able to see who's asked a question, and then we can ask you each in turn. So I think most of you know that SANParks is busy now trying to rehabilitate our dunes, and a number of paths, some rather casual paths have started springing up, and they've been reproducing, it would seem, and now there are quite a few of them through the dunes where normally there weren't any. And so Zandrie did send us a message, a letter, which I have, and I can forward to you, but I think it was shared on the Scarborough Mail, but that explains the value of keeping the dunes intact and not destroying them. So we can talk about that a bit later, and I'm sure Zandrie will cover that. But tonight's, we've got George speaking first, and George Branch, and then we were supposed to have Dave, but Dave Gaynor's had to rush off for a baboon meeting. As you know, baboons are a bit of a hot topic at the moment. And then after Dave, Zandrie, who's the section park ranger of Table Mountain National Parks, the Redhill, she's going to give us a bit of a rundown about SANParks' role and responsibilities. So I'll start with our first speaker, George Branch. He probably needs very little introduction to many of you. And at the risk of making him sound old, his lectures when I was in undergrad were some of the highlights of my undergrad career. So, and he and Margie have had a career of decades researching the coast and the life in it. And they just so obviously love the sea and the life in it. It's so evident in their books and when they talk. And so I think we're really privileged to have you join us, George. And I'm really delighted you could talk. So I don't want to steal any more of your time. Dave has had to go away, as I said, but he sent a presentation which I'll play part of. But I'm going to hand over to you, George.
Thank you very much, Colleen. I must say I find it totally weird talking to an audience that I can't see. This is a first shot for me that I haven't done one of these talks in this way before. So I'm going to jump, I think, straight into sharing the talk. Are you seeing my talk now?
It's coming. Just one second.
Not yet.
There we are.
Yeah, it's come up.
It's come up, has it? Is everybody seeing my first screen that has a heading on it, the ecology of dunes? Everybody seeing it?
Yes.
Yes, I have a picture of you and Margot.
Yes.
So Colleen asked me to give some broader perspective on dune ecology. And I'm going to sweep you around the coast here to different places. That photograph on the left, incidentally, is near Cozy Bay on the east coast, which is one of my favorite dune systems in the whole world.
That's beautiful.
Sorry, this is, I must learn to give time for the slides to come up. It takes a few seconds for each slide to come up. So the first point I wanted to make is that sitting on the west coast here, we're sitting in an area that is fantastic from the marine life in the sense that it's nutrient rich, cold waters, upwelling, huge amount of biomass present here, but relatively low diversity. And that's exactly the opposite of what you see on the coast. And that is in turn reflected in the dune systems. In the bottom left photograph here, you'll see a photograph that I took up in Namibia of the desert dune systems there, and the contrast on the right-hand side with Cozy Bay. On the left-hand side, you're seeing how vegetation is extremely low in its diversity and very restricted. On the right-hand side, you're seeing how the east coast is fueled by the warmer water system supplying rain, and that in turn supplies the extraordinarily rich diversity that occurs there. We sit, in a sense, in a privileged situation down in the middle between these two here, because we live in a world here where the dune systems are intermediate between those extremes. It's pretty diverse, but as you will see, it's dominated by low-growing stuff, and it's a situation in which the vegetation is absolutely vital in terms of conserving the dune field systems right on the coast. This diagram, which is one that Margot prepared and appears in our book, Living Shores, summarizes the whole sweep that goes on, because we tend to think of dunes on their own, but in reality, dunes are part of a continuum that sweeps across the intertidal beach and connects into the subtidal surf zone. And you get different kinds of stresses and strains as imposed on the system there. I wanted to emphasize that as far as dune systems are concerned, biological control is absolutely imperative. If you take away the biological control, you destroy the entire dune system. Not only do you do that, but you remove the very essence of what that system operates on. And it's extremely difficult and takes a long period of time. On the bottom now, you can see how I've summarized data that we got from terrestrial dune systems on the left-hand side, where recovery periods of 40 to 100 years are not unusual. And then I wanted to shift your eyes to the middle of the screen, and you'll see systems there that are dominated by the physical setup. And as long as you maintain the physical setup, that system can recover in extraordinarily quick periods of time. Some recovery times there we've recorded when there've been dune mining there. In the intertidal system, we've recorded recoveries as short as 2 months. And now I want to take you to a different aspect of dunes, and that is the fact that the dunes are continuous and mobile, and that dunes are very often continuous between totally different kinds of systems. This photograph here is an aerial one, and it shows you the system operating between Hart Bay and sweeping across the neck there to supply Sandy Bay on the left-hand side. And I was absolutely thrilled to get this pair of photographs, because this shows the situation in 1958, and there we are now sitting close to the modern situation in 2014. And you can see how the dune bypass system has been completely enveloped and consolidated. And that has severe consequences at both ends of the scale. At the Hart Bay end of the scale, it meant that the dunes are accumulating and consolidating there instead of being swept across the dune bypass to the opposite end. I think there's a little bit of gentle irony here that this is the old police station that got engulfed by this particular dune field there. At the other end of the scale, I was given this delightful cartoon by Gavin Thompson exclaiming that we need to be seriously worried about Sandy Bay, because of course the dune that's normally supplied there by the dune pass system is now deprived of that. And indeed, you are discovering that the sandy beach that was there is scarcely a sandy beach. There's much more rocky system there. By the way, I couldn't resist putting in this illustration of Sandy Bay, because that's where Margot proposed to me. I'd like now also to just reflect on mega alterations to dune systems. And what I'm illustrating here is the mining that takes place in the west coast and the extreme north of the west coast for the diamond mining. But what I'm illustrating here is the extraordinary lengths to which that mining company, De Beers and Namdeb, go to rehabilitate the system afterwards. You're seeing here the early phase of rehabilitation, where the dune fields are being returned to the area. If you want some scale, you look at that huge construction on the right-hand side. standing beside the wheel of that is a human being, and you can get some idea of the magnitude of the scale. And then once the sand has been returned there, what the company does is, on top of that, it returns the surface soil that has been removed before any mining takes place and is stored separately with all its seed banks. That's then restored to the surface, and these screens are installed so that the stabilization can take place. It's an extraordinary effort that they undertake in that dune rehabilitation. Then if I sweep you across to the east coast, what you're seeing here is sand mining for heavy minerals, and you get an idea of the magnitude of the scale that's going on there. Now, it's true that rehabilitation does take place there, but I want you to notice on the top right hand, you're getting the situation as it stands at the moment where the mining is taking place. Then on the left in the middle, you're seeing rehabilitation, but it's rehabilitation in the form of non-native vegetation, which will ultimately form a crop that can be harvested. And in the front, you see the attempts at re-establishing natural vegetation, in which Acacia Karoo is installed as a primary colonizer there. But I want you to also appreciate that even with all those efforts at rehabilitation going on here, you're looking at a horrendously long time. The record here is recorded for what's happening to trees, for birds, and for millipedes, and you will see that even after 30 years, the recolonization that's been established there is only reaching approximately 60% of what the original status was. And now I'm sweeping you back to the very system that you are interested in. I'm not going to talk in great detail on this because I think other people will deal with that in more detail. But I thought this was an incredibly insightful photograph taken of you from Google Earth. You can see how in front of the houses, there are multiple paths threading their way through the dunes, and you can see the interruption to the vegetation. And then as you move your eyes downwards, you see it starting to diminish, and then you end in the bottom there, just below that road there. That's where the fence crosses for the Cape Point Park. And you can see the contrast in the structure of the vegetation there. It's not undisturbed because you can see some game paths moving through it, but you can see that the contrast is quite substantial. Finally, I want to end on a note that there are many things one can do. And one of the things that can be done is the construction of boardwalks that focus people's attention and also protect the vegetation on one side. Another thing that can be done is the construction of signboards, even if you have to expect that nature in the form of dune movements is not going to necessarily respect your own signboards. And you can construct educational signboards to inform people about what's going on, things like these dune fields. This particular one was one that Margot and her team constructed, and there are these signboards right around the country. But I wanted to show this particular one because it not only illustrates the fact that educational signboards can go up, but in this particular situation, you can see how wonderful rehabilitation has taken place on the dune itself. In spite of that, you can also see near the right-hand side that people still can't resist walking over that. And I'm going to end by just giving you some bottom line messages. The first message is you should be trying to keep things as close as natural as possible. We have a great tendency for saying we must stabilize dunes, but in reality, stabilization of dunes can be a terrible thing, because when you stabilize the dunes, what you do is you disturb the natural flow of sands, and very often you turn things like sandy beaches into totally rocky shores. Of course, you need to rehabilitate if that's necessary, but don't be lured into the temptation of doing so if it's not necessary. Especially respect the dune bypass flows, Don't build where it invites trouble, like the police station. Minimize the vegetation damage. Avoid excess paths and install boardwalks if possible. And walk on the beach, not on the dunes. At least two people are clapping, even for the rest of them aren't clapping.
They're on silent.
Like playing tennis without an audience.
It's quite awful, actually. So we'll save questions for the end.
That's fine.
Yeah, as he Carlson.
Do you want me
you can
to
also express thanks using the chat. Okay, so in the app black of Dave, of the presence of Dave, I'm going to try to play his the presentation he gave me. I'll play it up to a point where he gets to his first conclusion slide, and then I think we may have to stop there. But it's a really interesting set of presentations. I think we can share it on the Facebook page too, perhaps. So here I go, trying to share screen. Right, over to Dave.
It's coming. It was lovely to listen to George.
Would help if I. Hang on. Sorry, there we go.
The delay, you know, all the sharing. Yeah.
That's fine, Colleen. That's up for me.
Okay.
Colleen, just to be clear, there's no sound. I assume there's supposed to be sound. I don't know whether others can hear sound, but I can't hear any sound.
Yeah, I can't hear anything either. Have you muted it?
I don't know what's happened there. Where's Colleen? Okay. Colleen, you mute.
Okay, I think what's happening is my internet connection isn't coping with the presentation. So I wonder if we should, shall we go to Zandrie? And I've got some photographs that Dave sent me that I can also show of the beach. But they actually, the main point of Dave's thing is that there are lots of paths through the dunes. So I wonder, yeah, I've got the sound on, I'm doing everything. I think it actually just my system isn't coping with the video. Unless you have an idea, John.
Colleen, do you want to email it to me and I can try and do it from my side?
It's huge. It's like 620 something megabytes.
Oh, right, forget about it.
Yeah,
okay.
He actually drove to my house with it. So
Okay.
Thanks for the offer, George. Yeah, John, do you know any idea why I'm not getting any sound?
Yes, there's an option. Yeah, we discussed this earlier. There's an option where when you stay share, you'll see two buttons, and there's one which is on the sound. You can try that, but it does help if you've got a decent connection. So try that and see if that works.
Okay, I'll give that a try. Sorry, everyone.
Do you see the button?
Okay, I'm seeing the screen now.
I can see select a microphone. I don't know which, should I don't see a button. Oh, here, record.
Yeah,
Okay, well, you can see the photographs. I'll just talk over over the thing. You can see there, he's shown it pretty much what George was saying. There are a lot more paths on the one side, but you can see plenty of paths through the beach, through the vegetation.
Colleen, we've lost you.
I've lost your presentation.
Sorry, it just keeps bombing out. I think it's my system. I keep saying you have very low internet connection. So I think let's move on to Zandrie. Zandrie, if you're ready to present your talk. And what we'll do is we'll share Dave's presentation on Facebook or something.
Sure, not a problem. Just give me a second.
Yeah, so I should probably introduce, I've mentioned Zandrie already. She is the section ranger for Redhill, for Table Mountain National Park. And she did send us a really interesting and helpful letter the other day explaining the value of looking after the dunes. But yeah, I'm sure she's going to give us more now. Thank you so much, Zandrie.
That's a pleasure. Good evening, everybody. So I'm going to hide myself because I don't like staring at myself. Okay. So what I'm going to try and do is try and cover the Scarborough Beach Dune Rehabilitation presentation for the rehabilitation work that we've done to date and then obviously going forward. But I'd like to start off by looking at the TMNP management in a whole and some of the objectives that we've got for the area and that is applicable, and then obviously looking at the getting closer to home, which is the southern section of Table Mountain National Park, and then going into the Scarborough Beach Dune Rehabilitation Project as a whole, and then what legislation will be applicable in terms of the work that we are going to do and going forward. So I'll start off with Table Mountain National Park management. So the intent for Table Mountain National Park is obviously to protect the areas of the important biodiversity, the scenic areas, and obviously including some of the most important heritage sites in and around Table Mountain National Park. Currently, one of the highest risks to the biodiversity inside Table Mountain National Parks is the impact of recreational activities due to our open, non-gated areas within the park. The main objectives for Table Mountain National Park and the ones that I've selected is basically focusing obviously closer to the fact that we are dealing with dune rehabilitation and the areas and the users that are currently going over the dunes. So the first objection is obviously the rehabilitation and restoration of the natural patterns and processes of the degraded areas. It's to ensure that human impacts are managed or restricted in order to maintain the ecological integrity. And lastly, to re-establish self-sustaining habitats that closely resembles healthy functioning ecosystems that are protective, productive, and valuable in a conservation sense. Obviously, taking into consideration that this is for future generations. So if you look at the southern section of Table Mountain National Park, and there's something interesting to look at, is the fact that the entire southern section is about 17,800 hectares, of which I'm currently managing, or my official position is the radial section ranger, which is 5,100 hectares. But because of an open position, I've been managing Cape of Good Hope section, which is 7,800 hectares since last year, August. So about a year that I've been managing two sections, and of which Scarborough Beach is 31 hectares, which equals to 0.24% of the entire area, which puts into perspective maybe about what is happening in and around the southern section and how we would go about in terms of getting to certain duties and the rehabilitation, and why it's so important that we started off immediate or continuing to do the rehabilitation of the area with the limited or the constraints that we currently have in place after COVID, which is obviously, unfortunately, financial constraints and staff capacity. So if you look at the Scarborough Beach Dune Rehabilitation, the project started in June 2019, where we selected as per the letter that I shared, or that they shared for the community. It's basically, we thought about starting it off small and then breaking the beach into the various sections, and then trying to tackle the dune rehabilitation in a slower format. But unfortunately, we have come to the realization that this is not possible, especially going forward. And the main objective that we've got for the first initial thing that we will be doing for 2020 is to close off all illegal footpaths. This is, like George says, it's probably the biggest impact that we currently have to the dune system of Scarborough, and that is due to the movement of the users and the community members, and sometimes even outside visitors that park in the parking areas and then moving through the dunes. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19, it also resulted in the only way that people could have stayed undetected during this time period. And it worked to some extent, but unfortunately the dunes have now taken the toll because of that. So going forward, again, like we want to do, so if I close the dunes off, the illegal parts, I talk I, but it's actually SANParks, Table Mountain National Park in a whole. We remove one user group entirely. And this one user group will then, if that gets removed, you will automatically see that your visitor numbers actually going onto the dunes will be reduced. I know that there's a lot of questions about keeping a path open, and I'm going to tackle it now while I'm busy with the presentation. Although I do see the need or the request for footpaths or legal paths to be kept open, unfortunately that is not viable for the environment and what it needs at the moment. We are trying to do the rehabilitation project in a way that it is more natural than us actually affecting it or forcing it to be in a certain way. So there are official footpaths that should be used, which, like listed, it is the Scarborough picnic site, which goes around the Cape of Good Hope section's fence line. And then you've got Scarborough Boardwalk, which stops, just for interest sake, it actually stops just before the actual formation of a dune because of a shifting dune system, which is why the last part of that dune is actually covered with sand, because that is actually what happens to a boardwalk if it is built on a shifting dune system. Then obviously moving back towards main parking area, there is about 3 illegal footpaths that you can clearly see. Obviously some people do move in various directions. That needs to be closed off. The picture that you can see, it's one of the one footpath we tried to close last year, but unfortunately that one was removed and the sign disappeared for a while. But thank you for whoever put it in a way that we could find it. But that is one of probably the best way to describe. You can look at the vegetation and you will see if that gets removed and you allow the natural growth of vegetation, it will close itself and that path will be removed. And immediately if you get to the dune system, then the paths will have the less amount of impact, and the undercutting of dunes will then be removed. Because every single path that we have at the moment on that dune system, what happens is if the wind sweeps through it, it actually undercuts the dune where the sand heaps become smaller or becomes deeper and your path becomes wider and you lose an entire sand dune system or heap, if you want to call it like that. So unfortunately, the best way forward and the more natural approach to it is going to be to close all illegal footpaths going forward, and then to look at where specific erosion control measures need to be implemented to allow the sand to be built up naturally. We will do that in cases where we can plant vegetation to try and make the dunes form an area where it's closer, where there's more nutrient-rich soils. We will obviously look into that and then implement those measures as well. But I think the one thing that we need to touch on is legislation. So a lot of people, through the history of my time with SANParks, which was over 10 years, is probably the understanding the part of how do we enforce the laws as SANParks officials, what gives us the powers, what is our functions and our duties. So basically, we are mandated in terms of the National Environmental Management Act of 107 of 1998. Obviously, these acts get amended, so to try and put that into perspective is going to take a while. I am going to try and keep this as short as simple for everybody to understand. If there are questions or you want the legislation, please ask me afterwards, because if we have to go into detail and in depth of each and every act, we're going to sit here for weeks. Okay, so the National Environmental Management Act provides for the cooperative environmental governments, establishing the principles for decision-making on matters affecting the environment. So basically, this law is the one that appoints the EMIs in terms of Section 31 to secure compliance with certain environmental legislation. So to make it simple, so the National Environmental Management Act is basically what we would call the mother act of all the CEMAs that's below it. And CEMAs are specific environmental legislations that we are mandated. So if someone has to be an appointed EMI, you need to be a permanent employee of an organization. So in this case, with SANParks or Table Mountain National Park, we've been appointed in terms of Section 31 for compliance and to monitor compliance and to enforce it. So in terms of that, to make it easier, so if you go and look at Section 31A to 31Q, you will find that the appointment, our functions and our powers and our duties all fall under these sections. And it is quite, I think, if you want to educate yourself more, this is probably one of the most important sections to actually read and educate yourself on. Also going forward, for interest's sake, your police officials actually can be EMIs as well, but they excluded in terms of certain two duties that we've got that they don't have the powers automatically. But it is an interesting read. So out of the NEMAs, obviously, as an EMI, we are appointed to enforce a couple of specific environmental legislation. Of the first one, which is the Protected Areas Act. This act, number 57 of 2003, actually provides for the protection and conservation of ecologically viable areas that represent of South Africa's biological diversity and its natural landscapes and seascapes. This is also the act where your protected areas can be declared, and in this case, your national parks are declared, your protected areas or special nature reserves will be declared in terms of this act as well. But it's really important to understand that there are rules and regulations that are set in terms of this act, and they've got provisions for certain things to take place and what or not to happen inside a national park. And Section 86(1)(d) specifically prohibits or restricts certain activities or land use that could have an adverse effect to a protected area or be harmful to a specific environment. And you need to, I think what you need to understand is that when there's regulations and rules in place, it's obviously looking into fact it stems back from the National Environmental Management Act, but it also goes back to the fact that it goes to our Constitution. So everybody has a right to a protected environment or be protected for future generations. This is where everything comes from. Our Constitution is basically what drives every other law that comes after that. So failure to comply with these prohibited regulations may result with a conviction of a fine not exceeding 5 million rand or 5 years imprisonment, and in some cases it could be both. Obviously, this is determined by the court and not by us. In terms of the National Environmental Management Protected Areas Act, there are in some cases where a fine can be issued in terms of the fine list that is available as well. And they've got set amounts that we can't change. But in cases where it triggers a more serious offense, then this is where you would have to end up with, or it results in an arrest, and the arrest then gets taken, obviously goes to court, where they will convict the person if they are guilty or not guilty of the said offense. The second one that we are appointed in terms of, or to enforce, is the Natural Environmental Management Biodiversity Act, 10 of 2004. Now, the following two, but the NEMBA, which we call NEMBA, NEMBA and the law that I will discuss afterwards, it's important to remember that there are no fine lists in terms of these acts for the EMIs of Table Mountain National Park to enforce. If somebody triggers this, the following two laws, it is immediate arrests. And unfortunately, in the case of the protected area and the Scarborough dune system, there are various threatened and protected species which will trigger the Biodiversity Act. And then it will be, there are no other options but arrests. And I think that's what I believe, that education is needed to know that this is what could happen. You've got the milkwoods, you've got listed and threatened species, which includes animals, the fauna that moves around, the plant species, and everything that is around that specific dune system that utilizes it on a daily basis. Also estuary, the seasonal estuary that you've got running down from the riverside. So the National Environmental Management Biodiversity Act basically provides for the management and conservation of South Africa's biodiversity, which includes the protection of species and ecosystems that warrants national protection. Now, the law that, or the section that will be triggered if something or prohibited activity or restricted activity has been taken place on the dune system is section 51, which restricts certain activities in terms of listed or threatened species. This could be damaging to vegetation, cutting of vegetation. I think most people are aware of, if you cut milkwoods or you want to trim in your own garden, you need a permit to do it. That is where it gets, that's an example of when it gets triggered. So failure to comply with these restricted activities may result in a fine or imprisonment not exceeding 5 years. If you are interested and you don't understand, if you go and read the laws, do yourself a favor, go look at the dictionary or the explanation of a certain word, and they will actually list all the restricted activities or the species, and they will give it to you at the end of the day to go and read it up. If you can't find the meaning, it usually means that there is a dictionary. The dictionary version will be used in that case. Then last but not the least, and I think it is probably the most important one for the Scarborough dune rehabilitation that is going to take place, and that is the National Environmental Management Integrated Coastal Management Act of 24 of 2008. So this law was made to establish a system of integrated coastal and estuary management, including the norms, standards, and policies in order to promote conservation of the coastal environment and to maintain the natural attributes of coastal landscapes and seascapes. So it is important to remember that all people, including myself, even though I am a SANParks official and an environmental management inspector, as a citizen of South Africa and part of the organization, must act with due care to avoid negative impacts on the coastal environment and coastal resources. So the one I'd like to use, and this is probably one that speaks to the illegal footpath, which I know and the reason why I'm going on to that one specifically is because I've received some emails regarding extra paths to be opened up or kept open for the use to make it easier. And that is to know that the access to the use of the coastal properties may be prohibited or restricted if it forms part of a protected area, which in this case it forms part of the national park, which is a protected area, or if doing so is in the interest of protecting the environment. So this law makes actually provision for offences to be split or divided into two different categories, of which if you trigger category 1 offences, it could result in a fine of 5 million rand or up to 10 years imprisonment. And in severe cases, you could end up with both. Category 2 offences may result in a fine of 2 million or up to 5 years imprisonment, obviously in both. And then they do prescribe, even though I haven't listed it, the Integrated Coastal Management Act also prescribed where it's where you have done it a couple of times or been caught more than once, they can combine the two categories and offences, and they can also look at specific species and work out an amount in terms of the species that you've damaged or that you've done activity in terms of. But I think that is probably the one thing that I would say that we really, all of us need to start looking at, is educating ourselves on the legislation and where it stems from and why it's there. Then also in terms of the Integrated Coastal Management Act, this is also the boundary line. So it's not just in terms of the protected areas, it's even if there's construction taking place on coastal properties. This could be outside a protected area and it could be open space for your servitudes that's opened up and things like that. This law triggers that, including your marine species that move in and out around the area. And that's it.
Thanks.
So I don't know if that went too fast, but hopefully if there's questions, they're more than welcome to ask at the end.
Great. No, thank you, Zandrie. That's very interesting. And yeah, so I don't know, John, apparently Claire Spotters would kindly brought the stick to you. Do you want to, with Dave's talk, do you want to have a go at
we're going to give it a go.
saying it?
We're going to give it a go.
Okay, good luck. Great.
I'd like to apologize for not being here in person, but it's a pleasure to be able to give some of my ideas about the dunes of Scarborough. Carlson sort of asked me to say something. I felt uniquely less qualified than a lot of people in the village to talk about it. All right, so here is Scarborough, here's Scarborough Beach. I mean, our magnificent area. So I think I better start off with some full disclosure. I've got minimum previous experience apart from being an undergraduate slave. I did work as an undergraduate. I insisted in work, did the field work in Gaynor when I was at Rhodes University, doing work for Roy Lubke and Ted Avis. So it was funny coming back to thinking about dunes here. And here's the Gaynor dune succession. And what I just did is I just took the photographs I took in Scarborough.
So I just want to see, can you see the main screen? Or Colleen, can you see it and hear it all right before I go on?
I'm seeing two slides next to each
There's
other.
a lot more similarity
George
with
might
coastal
want-
systems than in the Fynbos systems versus the sort of
Can you hear
Eastern
it?
Cape coast. Initially,
Yeah, that's much
initially
better.
I just wanted to do this briefly. Carlson asked me, what do you think about the dunes? I said, first get an aerial view. This is from Google Earth. And over here, we can actually see there's houses and there's paths down from the houses. And you've actually got clear paths here. And where the paths, there's more bare patches. So access is affecting the dunes opposite the houses, whereas it's not affecting the dunes opposite wetland. Okay, and here I've just tried to make that clearer. This is the part around opposite the houses with access paths and the dune around the wetland. And you can see we are making an effect on the dunes. You know, here in more detail, here's the 4 dunes in front of the houses and the 4 dunes in front of the wetland. You can see the difference. So as a zoologist, as a scientist, I think, well, okay, how can we judge what condition our dunes are, you know? And the easiest thing is to find a similar place in a protected area. Fortunately, we've got exactly that here. I mean, we've got Scarborough Beach with Witsunds at the top and Scarborough down at the south. And we've got a sort of very similar situation with Hoek van Bobbejaan, okay? Except it's in a protected area. It's got the same base structure, it's got the similar size, the same orientation, and the similar adjacent topography with mountains coming up from the beach. So I thought it would be interesting just to actually look and see what a natural situation would be like. Okay, just to at the bottom of that blue, which is the marine protected area, there's Hoek van Bobbejaan. This is just really to show you that Hoek van Bobbejaan is right in the middle of the reserve. It's not close to any road, probably close to the circular drive. So it is actually quite a natural area. It doesn't get lots of usage and human sort of in there. Okay, so let's have a look here. I mean, the first thing to see is Scarborough Beach on the left and Hoek van Bobbejaan on the right. We see that the four dunes are actually quite dynamic, and you do get like these blowouts, like these winds coming in from the northwest, probably together with storms and storm surges and blowing out the dunes. So we're getting quite serious blowouts in an area without degraded dunes in the reserve, and in fact Scarborough is looking pretty. It's looking very different, but it's quite interesting to note. Very similar structure, a rocky point with kelp out at the point. Quite interesting. And if we look a bit closer, we do see vegetation is isolated by drifting sands and, quite interestingly, game paths, you know. So what you see is the natural thing isn't totally devoid of paths, because humans, to some extent, have replaced animals in terms of making paths down to the beach. So where you don't have eland and bontebok and baboons walking down to the beach, you kind of have humans walking down to the beach. Here's just a bit more four-dune detail. So Scarborough Beach on the left in front of the wetland and Hoek van Bobbejaan. It's quite interesting from a, there's not a lot of difference, but you can see in front of the Scarborough, in front of the beach houses, is this very regular paths down and the regular denudation along the dune slacks. What are my conclusions? There's degradation related to access and proximity, because of proximity to the car park and paths. There is degradation. This needs to be addressed. The other thing just to bear in mind is four dunes in the situation appear to be dynamic if one compares it with Hoek van Bobbejaan. And, I just want to raise a sort of point. So should the goal be stabilization and complete vegetation cover? I think probably not. I think, are we trying to conserve natural processes? That's the kind of question we must ask ourselves. This does not always necessarily have to be the case. And, one of the things that, just looking at those pictures, I think sort of nature's not always tidy and fits into human aesthetics. So that was all fine. And then I got an email from Colleen. I said, I'm not sure whether I should do this. I'm not an expert. She says, I like a comparison, even if we acknowledge that they may not be exactly the same in currents, aspect, etc.
Hi, Colleen, do you want me to stop here and I'll hand it back to you?
Yeah, I think so. I think we should share the rest of that via the SEG webpage or Facebook somehow. It is very interesting, but I watched the rest of it, and we're in for another I think quite a few minutes. But it is worth watching. But he goes on quite an interesting botanical exploration. He goes into the reserve and gets photographs. It's lovely. But I think we probably want to stay focused on the sand dunes, and like on the actual Scarborough issue at the moment. So I feel a bit dictatorial, but I think we need to probably start asking if people have questions, and because I think we've had some very interesting chats, and it'd be great to hear from people. I've had some messages, just to let you know, while I've got the microphone, as Sissa was. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, do you want to type a Q on the side? You just type a Q in the chat thing, and then I can direct a question to one of the speakers. Otherwise, I have a question, and since I've got the microphone, I guess I can be dictatorial. So I just want to know, George and Zandrie, do you know, are there studies where anybody's actually shown that degrading these sand dunes can lead to a lot of, has anybody actually put like an economic study, I guess, on the damage? If you have a degraded sand dune, what does that damage cost? Has anybody ever done like a resource economic study that you might know of?
I don't think anybody's done a specifically economic study, but for example, on the East Coast at Sordona Bay, there's been a study that accounts for the economic value of sediment and sediment trapping that's accounted for by, in that case, by the coral reef system. It's a staggering figure. I can't remember the exact value. I think it's something like 146 million a year or something like that. And that's, you know, if that supply of sand were to cease, then the dune system would disappear and the beach would disappear. I'm trying to think if there are any other economic studies that oh yes, Margot's just reminded me, although it wasn't a sort of concrete economic study, for instance, at Arniston, dune stabilization was embarked upon with great zeal there. And what effect that has was to cut off the dune field, the bypass dune field that used to sweep across, and literally the entire sandy beach, which was the favorite local swimming beach, disappeared. It was converted into a rocky shore. And then they put a lot of money into destabilizing the dunes and allowing the flow again, and the beach returned. So although rands and cents can't be pitted up, you know, it certainly would have been fairly easy to do an exercise like that. Yeah.
I think also if you actually look closer to home, if you go look at Witsands. So if you take a couple of years ago, you used to have these huge sand heaps that were natural, and I'm talking of maybe 2005, 2006. I mean, that's completely gone. They removed the bulldozers that came in that swept the whole area, and they're still trying to recover that entire dune system. Another one to look at is hardpay dune rehabilitation, or the restoration of the hardpay dunes. But I think the costing depends on the degradation of the specific dune system and in which area it is, and obviously where it actually takes place. If you're going to try and look at South African versus Europe versus Australia, if you actually start looking at various research projects or where there are current rehabilitation processes or projects taking place across the world, you will actually start looking at different numbers. So the costing will depend on the actual degradation of a specific area, if that helps.
Zandrie, just on that subject, the Baden-Powell drive looks to me like it just drives through the dunes there. And I always think about how when there's a strong wind, often it looks like you're just driving on the dunes. And I thought maybe that was also because those dunes are a bit, well, really, they're very disturbed. Sorry, Karen.
Baden-Powell is a good example. It's actually a perfect example where a road should never have been built in the first place, because it actually was built on a moving sand dune. So the shifting dune system there is just trying to take back what should be theirs in the first place.
Question about, do you know a date roughly when you'll be closing the illegal paths
So
that go through the dune?
yeah, so basically I haven't set a set date because I wanted to make sure that we do the educational part first, and I actually waited for tonight's meeting to try and raise the awareness first before going into the fact. But we will be starting that fairly soon, and we'll be closing with indigenous vegetation which we collected after doing all our opening of footpaths and things after lockdown. So we are trying to get all the vegetation in. So as soon as we do get our vegetation, we've got a certain section, then obviously we will try and do it from, like I said in the letter, we will start from Schusterskral Boardwalk moving towards the car park. With my discussion this morning with Carlson, just so that everybody is aware, we are not planning on closing the parking areas that you can see in front of those paths, because we do realize that there aren't really a lot of parking, and especially the residents staying on Beach Road, that they sometimes utilizes those parking bays for their visitors as well. So we will just focus on the actual closure of the path itself and not that parking space, because it's already, you can see that it's disturbed areas. Some of the area, those parking bays actually have tar and things in it as well, if that helps.
I have two questions. I have two questions. Can I raise them?
Go for it.
They're for Zandrie, actually. My first question is, I wanted to know what the legal status of volunteer rangers is in terms of implementing any action against people who are trespassing in the dunes.
So in terms of volunteer rangers, in terms of what volunteer rangers? Sorry.
Well, what is their legal status? Are they entitled to take action against people, or do they have to just simply act as eyes and ears?
So there's obviously, so your SANParks employees, so like I said in my presentation, is obviously you've got the environmental management inspectors, and the only way that you can actually be designated in terms of that is if you're a permanent employee. Nothing stops educational somebody to prevent somebody to do education or give a session or warnings in terms of that. So if you've got environmental monitors, tourism monitors that's working with us, although they're not designated as EMIs, they obviously have the right to do an educational session. They've also got a right to call in a designated EMI to deal with it. In terms of the, if you've got, so education is free to everybody. And there's also something called the citizen's arrest. So if you see somebody actually doing an illegal activity, doesn't matter what law it actually contravenes, you've got all the right to do a citizen's arrest.
Thank you.
So can I come in here? It's George Smith. I'm an honorary ranger.
Yes, go for it, George.
We don't have any powers other than the ordinary citizen. We are purely eyes and ears. So we don't have any, we can't issue fines, we can do nothing except inform people. But we try to do that in support of SANParks.
There's some questions coming up on the side, okay. So firstly, Charles says St. Francis Bay is an interesting example, and I guess that must be the shifting dunes discussion. Sorry, I haven't been keeping an eye on this. And then Kelson's given some comments on how we can help. Angela would like to know: are there any plans to lessen degradation of the dunes on the northern end of the beach to the right of the car park? So I guess that's, yeah, heading off towards Muscle Beach.
Yeah, so basically our main focus at the moment, because the main beach is where you've got the highest visitor impact, not just from your residential side, but also obviously normal beach users and surfing communities and things moving in. So our main focus point for the start of the rehabilitation project is obviously Main Beach, but it will continue further, actually also going towards from Schusterschroll around the Cape of Good Hope fence, and then taking the section from the car park going towards Muscle Beach. But that is the plan, long-term plan.
Hans, Hans, do you want to give your question, or should I just read it out? Okay, I'll read it out. Hans says, Dave seems to be saying, don't try to freeze the dune system as was done in Arniston. Is the SANParks approach allowing for a dynamic dune system? What part of the dunes must be secured and what part must be left free to move?
So I think the most important part is actually to, if you understand the natural dune system and how the movement happens, is our main focus point is those areas that we know is human impacted. So if you see a dune movement is naturally moving to the right or the left side, we will change the path. One of the examples is actually when you look at the path that will lead from Schusterschroll boardwalk down onto the dune. That area where we will extend it will move as the dune moves. So we are going to allow for the natural process of the dune movement, but also ensuring that we can get rid of those areas where the human impacts have formed all these paths, and then where there should have been natural vegetation where it's been trimmed open or kept open, those should close naturally at the end of the day if need be, and we need to plant vegetation in the more nutrient rich soils compared to your dune, the dune sands at the bottom, then or your normal sand, beach sand, then obviously that will move as time goes. But as you can see from last year when we started the project, the water only came to a certain point and we could do a rehabilitation to a certain extent. And this year when the storm came, it was gone. So yeah, so we'll allow for the natural process to take place and then just move as it allows us to go. But the main focus point is the illegal footpaths, which will remove user groups.
I see John is sharing. Oh, John, you're sharing the picture. Do you want to speak to the photograph?
I just thought it would be useful. This is from the Apple Maps in 3D to see. This is obviously the south side, but also I hadn't quite appreciated looking at the north side. I don't know if you can see this. Yes. The extensive set of paths going through there, and whether we're looking to regulate elements of that as well, because this bit here to the north of the car park, you can see it's very extensively used. And then here, of course, there's these two paths coming through. So I don't know if that's helpful for the discussion. If there's any comments on that.
Well, I certainly think it goes to Angela's question about what are we doing to the north. I suppose it has to go in small steps. But yeah, gosh, that's very interesting.
Yeah, so basically on the right-hand side of to the north of the car park, you will see that you've got the illegal footpaths which leads down, and then the main one that goes from, it's basically behind the Scarborough toilets. And then you can see the path moving all around with the vegetation to Muscle Beach side. And then they've got the links that goes down to, obviously, residents and local users that know about it will go down to the shore. But the extent, if you even compare the north to the south side, you can see the extensive damage, and where we need to step in is definitely the Main Beach area. That's where the priority lies. Also, if you actually move up towards the Cape of Good Hope fence, just move to the left, more south for me. Thank you. There you will also see the impacts that it has. We know that, unfortunately, dunes are also a nice hideaway spot. When the surfers go, they try and they hide things in the bushes or in the dunes where nobody can see it. And that is the bottom part. I wish I had a pointer now. Where they've been trying to hide away from the wind or hiding their gear away.
Yeah, that was useful. Thank you.
I wonder if I could be thoroughly controversial for a moment. Are we perhaps overreacting to the human influence, given that prior to that human influence, there were probably natural game paths there that would have created similar traverses through the vegetation?
So no, because if we take that approach to every single impact or something, but towards the environment, we're going to lose everything. So in terms of that, so a natural game path that you will find inside, let's use Cape of Good Hope because that's the closest section, it doesn't get utilized every single day, every single minute. But your game moved from one area to another. So this morning, the eland moved from Klaasjagersberg over the road back into the Schusterschral area, or going towards past the Scarborough, towards the Scarborough fence line towards Schusterschral. I mean, that's one movement, one group of eland moving. You're talking impact every single minute, but on a good, beautiful day, it's high impact numbers compared to a game that's moving through a path maybe once a day, twice a day, or maybe once a week, depending on where they want to go feed on it at that time.
That's a good answer. So what you're saying is it's the magnitude and frequency of the impact that's the concern, not the agent that's doing it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we need to change human behavior.
Yeah. I was very interested when John was showing that image a moment ago, and we were looking at the north versus the south. In the north, it was quite clear that there were actually only two major paths through there. And they each start at a fairly fixed point. I think you said one of them was from a toilet and goes down. I'm not sure what the other one.
The toilet runs across.
So did I hear you correctly in saying that your priority is not to worry about this so much as to worry about the other area to the south where the damage is much more frequent?
No, it's not about priority. It's about where we're going to put our resources. So obviously resources are limited. That's why I said it's 0.23% of our management area is Scarborough. Yeah. So obviously we can't cover the entire area in one go and try and tackle it immediately. So our main focus is where the your highest risk or the highest impact are at the moment, and that's the main beach. And then as we move along, we will cover the areas where it's, I won't even say least concern because everything is a concern. Then we will move into the areas where we can after we've done the main beach area.
I mean, it does just seem to me that that area to the north where there are only two paths, I would personally not be too uptight about having two paths through there, as long as they stick to two paths.
Yeah, unfortunately, what counts for the one side will count for the other side. You're setting a precedent then. So no illegal footpaths. There's sufficient entrance points to the beach, which is what is a requirement for the actual public or coastal zone. And you've got, if you compare the entry points for Scarborough compared to any other beach, you actually have more than some of the other areas. So Dyer's Beach inside Cape of Good Hope, I've got one staircase leading down to a beach. Here you've got about 4 different entry points, because Muscle Beach has got that big sand dune on the right hand side where there's the sign which has been opened, not the illegal footpath going through. But then you've also got the main car park, which actually has 3 entry points. Obviously this is before my time when I started at Redhill section, when they've designed those entry points, and that's official parts. But all the others are illegal parts and they should be closed, or they must be closed. They are not a requirement.
I also wondered if it wouldn't be interesting for you to use something like Google Earth and go back in time and see what was happening over time, because it's quite hard to pinpoint whether it's just human damage or whether it's a natural movement, as you saw at Bobbion's Hook. And I think that the time factor would give you a measure of how much of this is just human intensification and damage versus...
Well, I think then we need to go back before Google Earth. Before the houses were built.
If you have images, you know, Google Earth goes back quite far. I've been looking at images back to about 1960.
It depends how far back you want to go. So if you want to go back to before humans actually even came into the area, then you're going to see a completely different picture. But in this case, that's the problem, is not the biggest thing that we need to change, and I'm including myself to it as well, is that us as humans are the reason that we've got the degradation happening across the world and in their time, but even just in Table Mountain National Park. That's unfortunately what it is. And if we as normal citizens or as environmental conservationists and environmentally aware citizens, we need to do what we can to try and protect the environment and the species that relies on that specific environment, because sandy beaches, rocky shores, your dune systems, they are there for a specific reason, and we need to protect them for future generations. That includes animals that only rely on those systems to exist. I'm going to use an example. So not many people, they want kelp to be removed, but there's organisms that rely on kelp to actually feed from it. So you're removing kelp from a beach and take it away, you're actually removing a food source.
Yeah, no, I agree. I just wanted to make the point that under relatively natural conditions, as you get in the park itself, in the protected part of the park where human movements are minimal, you do see natural paths through there, and you do see natural sand movements. So I think Google Earth would allow you to go back in time sufficiently prior to intense human activities, and it would allow you a much fairer comparison of, you know, how much of this is just natural dune movements.
Yeah, I think a good example is actually going from Cape of Good Hope Fence and you go into the area. That is a remote area on the left-hand side, just past Cape of Good Hope, where there used to be a Jeep track, old Jeep tracks that's been closed. You still have game paths running through it. It's an area where we don't even really go into unless it's necessary after poachers, or if there's something that's happening in terms of fauna, or if there's alien clearing inspections. We stay out of that area because it's a remote zone and we don't want it to be affected. So the paths have the time to actually close and then just go open again as an animal moves through.
I have one final little comment. It's not really a question, but I've noticed that private individuals who are attempting dune rehabilitation, and I'm thoroughly in favor of them thinking that way, but I've noticed that a lot of them are trying to use dried kelp to establish the rehabilitation. And this is probably the worst thing you can do, because dried kelp has various chemical properties and is actually very destructive of dune vegetation. We found this out on the west coast, further up the west coast, when people were harvesting kelp and they were dragging it into the dunes to let it dry. And we found basically that it completely degraded the vegetation in the areas where they were doing it. So it's just something to bear in mind. I know you people are not doing that, but some people are.
Yeah, so if you go look at what they currently did, they use the kelp for the bottom parts, which is the natural, your normal sand. It's not for the top right, where you've got more nutrient-rich soils, where our plants, the more the normal vegetation, so your rhus and your chrysanthemoides monolifera and things are growing. That's not where it gets used. That is covered by, if we want to stop a movement or that to close, then we actually use the normal vegetation to close those parts.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
George, were you watching Kilson's face while you were saying that about the kelp?
Well, that's why I like to see people.
I thought I saw dismay.
It was funny because I was just sending the question to you, George. What do you think about the kelp? And then, yeah, anyway, it was interesting. Thank you, Zandrie, for saving me there.
Yeah.
Always a pleasure.
I think the point that was being made there is removal of kelp is definitely not a good thing. You can understand it, it's on restricted beaches that are primarily for recreational swimming and so on, but as a general principle, I'm not in favor at all. You know, you can harvest kelp on a thoroughly sustainable basis, but removing it from beaches is definitely detrimental, and we have many documented cases of this.
Thanks, George. Appreciate it.
Great, thanks. Thanks, George. Any more questions or comments before we wind down and go and have our dinners?
Well, I think we should say thank you to you for setting this up. It always requires quite a lot of work.
Thank you.
And thank you for all the people who made contributions. Appreciate it.
And thank you for your time, everyone, and John for coming to the rescue, and Claire for driving to my house to fetch the talk. So yeah, it's been a real team effort. Thank you, George. Thank you, Zandrie. And Carlson for being the driving force behind all this. Thank you. And if George's books, if you'd like some, they really are fantastic. I'm actually going to update my 1981 Living Shores to the, I think it was 1981 that it came out, George.
Yeah,
I'm going to get them one. So yeah, so if anybody would like one of those, please do just email me. And I'll organize to fetch them from Berkeley for you.
Thank you, Colleen.
If you can also just share my email in case somebody have thinks about another question, I'll be more than happy to try and answer all the questions or comments if there are any queries after this, to try and get to them. Just bear in mind that it is 2 sections, so sometimes I do take a bit of time to respond to an email, but I will get to it at the end of the day.
Okay, thanks, Zandrie. Yeah, if you're willing to open your email box up to that.
It's part of the job.
I guess, yeah. But yeah, thank you everyone for making the time for this. Yeah, I'm seeing lots of thank yous coming in on the side. I think Zandrie, George, if you can all see that. Yeah, everybody's very grateful. So thank you again, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Thank you.
Yeah, so have a lovely evening. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye,
Cheers.
everybody.
Bye.